Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we will continue a conversation that we began in an earlier program about the rise of China and how that nation has become an economic superpower in just the past 3 decades or so. My guest today, again, is Dr. Jack Hao. Dr. Hao is a professor of economics, and he is also an expert in China's economic development. Welcome back, Jack, and thank you for joining us again on Talking Points.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
When we left off on the last program, we were talking about China and the current state of affairs there, and we will get back to that later in the show. But first, I want to spend some time talking about China's economic history, because they have a very interesting history, and many of our viewers may not realize that China was the world's #1 economic power back in the period leading up to the Industrial Revolution. So if we're talking about the 1600s and even into the 1700s, they were the world's #1 power, holding sway over as much as 1/3 of the world's GDP. So how was it, Jack, that China was in control of 1/3 of the world's gross domestic product during that period?
Well, China has historically been the leader of the world. If you look at Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, he spent more than 1/3 of the book talking about China. Again, Europeans were fascinated with the prosperity and success of China. Most of our audience have heard of China being the inventor of gunpowder and such. But remember, China invented the movable press centuries before Gutenberg. China invented crossbows about 1,000 years before Europe. China invented chroming, chemical chroming, by as late as 3rd century BC. But what was the main cause for China's success was its technology advancement in agriculture. For example, China used board plows, which allowed you to plow the land and turn the soil simultaneously by 400 BC. And Europe did show that, historical records show by 400 AD, the Roman Empire started using the mold plow, the board plow, but with the fall of the Roman Empire, it prevented it from being widely disseminated. It wasn't until the 1500s, when the Dutch traders brought it back from China, did it get wide adoption. And of course, that led to dramatic increase in agricultural productivity in Europe, which allowed the landowners to evict a lot of the peasants because they don't need as much workers, and the peasants flocked to the cities. So later on, when Industrial Revolution came along, Europe already had a ready labor force in the cities. But getting back, because of China's ability to the advances in their agricultural technology, complemented with a very sophisticated land management system, China was able to produce more than enough food to feed its population. And that is why, historically, China has been the most populous nation. And remember, up until more recently, by more recently I mean the last 200 years, we have gauged a country's prosperity, not in terms of GDP, but in terms of its population, its ability to feed and sustain this population. So in a nutshell, China's success was because of its land management and advanced technology in agriculture.
So the ability to sustain a population is what keeps a country strong in this case. And as you mentioned, there was a series of scientific discoveries or developments or technological developments that allowed China to move ahead, certainly in agriculture and the land management system that you referred to. This goes back all the way into the Song Dynasty, which was from, if my numbers are correct, from the year AD 960 to about 1280. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting and unique about the Song Dynasty and their ability to develop agricultural land management?
Well, for the Song Dynasty, it's important in several ways. The land management system I alluded to earlier on continued in China from probably 1000 BC all the way up to the Song Dynasty. By the time you got to the Song Dynasty, population outweighed the available land, so Song Dynasty was forced to change its land management system. People paid taxes not in terms of grain, but in terms of currency. That led to a financial commercial boom in China in terms of changes in taxation, which led to the economic development both in terms of transportation, lodging, etc. And financially, China started to see the emergence of early forms of long checks. Also, in Song Dynasty, there was a burst of intellectual curiosity about the physical world. By Song Dynasty, we've seen large scale, for example, using water as a source of power, large scale manufacture production, printing, etc. That's mainly in the northern Song Dynasty when they were defeated and forced to move south. That caused a widespread of intellectuals, because in the early days, the intellectuals who owned land could rely on the land and have perpetual income. But when they fled to the south, they were not able to bring the land with them, and hence they had to resort to either becoming entrepreneurs themselves or teaching. So that caused the much more widespread of intellectual education in China.
So educational development came as a necessity for those who were displaced from their previous land holdings. And then as we move along here, we see that the population almost doubled during the Song Dynasty, and their per capita income rose by a factor of 1/3. How were they able to accomplish that? And when we talk about agriculture, are we talking about rice as the primary crop?
Well, in the old days, when you had to pay taxes, you paid taxes in rice. And that's why, if you look at the old historical records, you will see a government official and his pay is in rice, because that's what the government's tax revenue was. But in the Song Dynasty, when you started paying in currency, that freed up the farmers to produce whatever the land and the climate was best suited for. That, among other things, of course, increased the productivity of farmers. And China historically has been relatively concentrated in the north. And when the northern Song was defeated and they moved southwards and became the southern Song, that opened up development, cultivation of the southern China, which was actually more fertile and more suitable for the production of rice and many other agricultural goods.
I've heard the term wet rice cultivation. Explain what that means, wet rice cultivation.
Well, wet rice cultivation is basically you have farmland where you flood it with water. Rice depends heavily on water. That's why in the northern plains where rainfall is relatively scarce, in the old days when they were still forced because of tax laws to produce rice, they were less efficient. They didn't have enough water. But in the south, where a farmer can easily produce 2 crops, in modern day, they can produce up to 3 crops a year. And rainfall is very important. Any of our audience, if you look at footage of rice paddies in China, you can see the farmers with their feet in knee-deep mud planting the soil, and you will see China very ingeniously used the mountainous terrains where you can have the water flow down step by step. That's how China was able to feed its population. This is, again, a technology where you can use your water resources and use that on hillside land.
Wrapping up the Song Dynasty, which ended around 1280 or so, that's about the time Marco Polo was traveling to that part of the world. And at that point in time, Genghis Khan and his ancestors, the Mongols, were in charge. And Marco Polo met Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and was quite impressed at the Xanadu Palace. What was it like at the Xanadu Palace when Marco Polo visited, and what kinds of things did he bring back to Italy?
Well, of course, from the Chinese point of view, spaghetti was actually Chinese noodles. Of course, I'm pretty sure our Italian audience probably would disagree. But remember, at that time in medieval ages in Europe, we see gloomy castles, damp, wet, where farmers were basically pseudo-slaves to the lord of the manor and such. And here you come to a country where you have a very well-structured bureaucratic system with palaces that make the European palaces basically look like huts. And I think that is why that probably planted the seed for the Western fascination towards China. Remember, when Marco Polo first talked about his tales, Europeans did not believe that this was possible.
And we know about the Silk Road and all of the things that developed as a result of that interaction. Let's talk about what happened during the Industrial Revolution, because China was at the top of the world and the Industrial Revolution happened and then they slid from there. You were mentioning earlier that in Europe, a lot of farming techniques improved so that there was an abundant population in the cities and villages to provide the labor. What happened in China and why didn't they follow suit?
Well, we talk about the more distant and the more recent. The more distant, by the time you got to the Ming Dynasty, which is after the Mongols, the Ming Dynasty, the third emperor, he seized power by overthrowing his nephew, and he gained a lot of support from the eunuchs in the palace. And to please the eunuchs, he gave more powers to the eunuch rather than the bureaucrats, which were mainly intellectual scholars. One of the ways he did that was to make the exam system so complicated that it basically constrained the imagination of the intellectuals. I feel that is probably one of the reasons for the beginning of the decline. And of course, it is because of this that the Western scholar Max Weber, who argued that Industrial Revolution owed a great deal of debt to Protestant ethic, and he criticized Confucian ethic as being a hindrance. I do not quite agree. I think it's mainly because of the imperial exam that led to the intellectuals being less imaginative. You can just imagine if all of our exams were multiple choice rather than essays allowing students to imagine and show their ideas. But in more recent terms, remember, by up to the 1700s, China's GDP population was equal to roughly the entire Europe. So for one country, it was by far the most dominant country. But by the early mid-17th century, China closed its borders, mainly because Western culture caused too much social unrest. And since China did not really need anything from the West, the emperor didn't find it feasible to tolerate the unrest caused by the West. So they closed the door to foreigners, foreign ideas. And remember, we're talking about mid-1700s, which is precisely the Industrial Revolution.
That was bad timing.
Exactly.
Speaking of timing, we have to take a break right now. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll fast forward to contemporary China and talk about some of the issues involved with China's current economic development. We'll see you in a moment. There's a world of opportunity available through the College of Continuing and Professional Education at Cal State Long Beach. Would you like to move ahead in the field of human resources and personnel management? Sign up for the Human Resources Management Certificate Program. You'll learn how to expand your knowledge and skills and advance in this dynamic industry. For more information, contact the College of Continuing and Professional Education at Cal State Long Beach. Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Jack Howe. We're talking about the rise of China and how that country has become an economic superpower in just over the past 3 decades. And Jack, before the break, we were talking about the economic history of China and how they have risen and fallen before, and now they're on the ascendancy. We find that China today is number 2, and most economists agree that they will be number 1 by around 2019 or so if present trends continue. What are the repercussions of China becoming the world's number 1 economic power?
Well, I always want to remind the audience, because of the inevitable rise of China becoming number 1 in terms of gross domestic product, people seem to have a fear of China. But remember, if you look in terms of per capita GDP, China is still way behind. China is still probably less than around 20 to 25% of the US. So even with this growth, it is still far behind in terms of the US. So I don't feel that there is any major repercussion worldwide.
And people need to realize that it's all about purchasing power parity and the lifestyle that the individuals can live within that country. And so a country may have the largest overall net wealth, but the people may not live as well as other folks in other countries. And that's what you were just pointing out.
Yes.
Okay, and as we talk about the reasons why China developed their economy the way they have in such a short period, one of those factors was a very large savings rate. Why did China have such a large savings rate, and how did this contribute to their growth?
Well, this is a very complicated issue. For the reason China had such a large saving rate was mainly because when they changed ideology from communism to a market-driven system, the iron rice bowl, where you are guaranteed from cradle to grave, that gradually disappeared. So the individual has to be responsible for his or her own retirement, and worst of all, his or her medical coverage. And there is an old saying, there are many families in China that are just one major medical instance away from utter poverty. And it is the fear of this that has caused the Chinese people to save so much, and the Chinese culture of trying to leave as much bequest to your children as possible. Of course, this, from a theoretical point of view, is the root cause for China's ability to create such large export surplus. And this large export surplus and the large saving rate allows the Chinese government to have the luxury of investing in its infrastructure. China's infrastructure investment accounts for 46% of its GDP compared to 12% in the US. Again, that's not sustainable.
And the problem with any economy that grows that rapidly is that at a certain point you hit the wall because you can only export to a certain point. You have to develop that internal consumer demand and the internal consumer market. And with China, with such a large population, that would be the next step. How are they doing on that, and why is it so important to balance that out?
Well, when I lecture in China, I try to remind the Chinese audience that the subprime crisis did cause pain for China. But in the long run, it was probably good for China. It forced the Chinese government and the intellectual community to sort of put on the brakes and look around and see there's something wrong. Something wrong, among other things, as you alluded to, too dependent on Western consumption, which is risky, as the subprime crisis showed. To get the Chinese people to consume more, part of it is going to be done by the government in terms of education, propaganda, which is still very important in the Chinese system. But China has also embarked on improving investment channels. That's one of their prime directives since last year. They have also tried to dramatically improve their healthcare and old age insurance, which will alleviate the need for such massive savings. If people do not have to save so much, that will free up a lot of their money for domestic consumption, which will lead to more domestic absorption and a more balanced growth for China.
And wages are rising in China as well. And China's average monthly wages are already higher than they are in Mexico on average, and they're continuing to rise. And this leads people to speculate that, well, that means that the never-ending chase for the cheapest labor will move elsewhere and go to places like Vietnam and Cambodia next door neighbors, and also perhaps Myanmar, which used to be referred to as Burma, and other parts of the world. But your conviction is that China is not too worried about Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar.
China is not that worried for several things. Western investors will forever be interested in China, not because of the cheap labor, but because the tremendous internal market potential. And if you look at the cheapest labor, yes, Vietnam, the labor is cheaper, but remember, the size of Vietnam pales in comparison with China. So if all of the Chinese Western industries in China immediately move to Vietnam or Myanmar, can you imagine the implication of the wages over there? That will probably go up threefold overnight. So in that sense, I think intellectually the Chinese are not worried about that.
And one of the things that China will need to do in order to foster this consumer market that they want to develop is to move up the scale, because in order to provide good quality jobs and to keep rising, the quality of the kinds of product that they're developing has to go up. So they need to innovate more and not just manufacture.
I don't remember who first coined this, but I think this is a wonderful terminology. It talks about the U.S. growth is growth through inspiration. And China's growth in the last 30 years or so has been growth through perspiration. And China needs to move up the food chain, so to speak, and use intellectual innovations for the source of their growth. China has invested tremendously in its education system, and I do predict the payoff will come about. But then remember, China also lacks in terms of a lot of complementary institutions, including intellectual property right protection and such. I know our time is short. We're probably not going to be able to fully cover this, so I'll leave this at here.
Okay, and I think that's an important point that you just brought up, though, and that is that in order to, again, rise up the scale of economic productivity and provide the so-called value-added aspect to the economy and to production, it's got to come in the way of ideas and intellectual development and services and things that won't involve as much of the heavy, intensive factory placement, which has led to the pollution problem in China.
Yes. The Chinese government has started, I would say, probably around 2009, and starting to, in the coastal cities where the original growth began, they are trying to move upwards in terms of the production ladder to be more with higher value added, and moved a lot of the production, potentially labor intensive, potentially more pollution industries more inland. So the coastal, where the wages are higher, where the land cost is higher, by moving up the value added, I think this is a smart move in terms of maintaining its growth.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is the one-child policy in China and how that has had some repercussions for their future. It did prevent, according to some estimates, it prevented the birth of maybe 400,000 folks that would have been born otherwise without that policy. But what is the impact of it now, looking 20, 30, 40 years down the road?
Well, the one-child policy was implemented in '79, independent of the economic reform, mainly out of necessity. China's growth was too low, productivity was too low, labor force, surplus labor was too high. But with the one-child policy, it also put a cap on China's ability to sustain a labor-intensive, export-oriented growth strategy. And again, I argue that is why the subprime crisis in the long run helped China. At the critical time, it caused the Chinese government to slow down, press on the brakes, so to speak, and look at alternative routes towards further development. China has already taken several measures in terms of loosening the one-child policy. Personally, I think it's a little bit too late, because it takes 16 years for you can produce a cup in 2 seconds, but it takes you 16 years to produce a worker. So I think it's a little bit too late, which means the government has to speed up its development in terms of moving up the value-added production chain.
And what has this policy done to the demographics going forward? What does the society look like in terms of age stratification?
Many of our audience have heard of what we call the population pyramid, where the elderly is a relatively small portion and the younger population is like the base of the pyramid being very large. In China, if you look at it, China is like a stack of coins. Because of the one-child policy, each generation is roughly about the same size, which is very problematic. According to estimates, by the year 2050, China will have 114 million population that are 80 years or older. And personally, I am extremely concerned about the healthcare cost implications.
One last thought, because we're running out of time again in this segment, but China holds a large number of U.S. Treasury bills. People have been concerned about that and the kind of leverage that gives China over the U.S. Is that leverage, or is that kind of an interdependency? 30 seconds or less.
I think it's interdependency, because China, to make sure that their investment holds value, they need to make sure the U.S. has successful and sustained growth. Otherwise, they are in trouble. They in China.
So we all rise or fall together in
Yes.
that scenario.
Yes.
Jack, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on Talking Points. Join us again for another episode soon. I'm Dave Kelly. Until then, have a nice day.